Tonight we get into Revelation chapter 8 as we continue in our study of the book of Revelation. And to remind you of where we're at in the grand scheme of things, I'm going to ask Stacy to go ahead and share with us the timeline that we've been going through that is in the front of your books. You have these, and as we remember, just sort of as a recap, chapters 1, 2, and 3 lead us up through the church age, up to the rapture at the beginning of chapter 4. The rapture is the pulling out of the church, the taking away of those Christians that are alive on the earth at that time. And then what we've read in chapters 5, 6, and 7 lead us up to the first quarter of the tribulation, or the first quarter of the overall tribulation. And so what we're going to look at in chapter 8 and 9 is going to go from here to here. It's going to finish out the first half of the tribulation. And remember that as we're talking, the breaking of the 7 seals leads up, and things get a little worse. And then next is the trumpet judgments, which we start talking about tonight, and they get a little worse as they go. Things get worse as it goes on. And then after we get through with the trumpet judgments, the whole last half, or the Great Tribulation as it is called, is going to be what they call the bowl judgments. And that's going to be all that we'll talk about in this time period here, basically, as far as judgments go. But they continue to get progressively worse as God shakes the very foundation of humanity's understanding of who He is and their rejection of Him as their Savior. And so tonight we're going to start in with Revelation chapter 8. And here's how we're going to do this. We're going to read all 13 verses, and then we're going to go back through and break it down as we go. But I want us to read it and get a whole full picture view of what's going on in chapter 8, and then we'll go back through and look at these 13 verses. Again, our study in this commentary is in the NIV, and so that's what I'm reading from tonight. But if you would follow along in your Bibles with me as we read, it says in chapter 8, beginning with verse 1, it says, "When he," talking about Jesus, "when he opened the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. And I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and to them were given 7 trumpets. Another angel, who had a gold censer, came and stood at the altar. He was given much incense to offer, with the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar before the throne. The smoke of the incense, together with the prayers of the saints, went up before God from the angel's hand. Then the angel took the censer, filled it with fire from the altar, and hurled it on the earth. And there came peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. Then the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets prepared to sound them. The first angel sounded his trumpet, and there came hail and fire mixed with blood, and it was hurled down upon the earth. A third of the earth was burned up, a third of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. The second angel sounded his trumpet, and something like a huge mountain all ablaze was thrown into the sea. A third of the sea turned into blood, a third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. The third angel sounded his trumpet, and a great star, blazing like a torch, fell from the sky on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters turned bitter, and many people died from the waters that had become bitter. The fourth angel sounded his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of them turned dark. A third of the day was without light, and also a third of the night. A third of the day was without light, and also a third of the night. As I watched, I heard an eagle that was flying in midair call out in a loud voice, 'Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, because of the trumpet blast about to be sounded by the other 3 angels.'" And so right here we get some, really good descriptions of what is going on during this time. And these things are very self-explanatory as we watch what's happening. Now I want to remind you as we go through this that as we've gone through this study, when we see something happening in heaven, that means that there is a corresponding thing happening on the earth. And that's what we're seeing here. Every time a trumpet is blown, there is a judgment being released on the earth. So when we see something happening in heaven, there's always going to be something happening on earth during this time. And so the very first thing, chapter 7 leads up to the first 6 seals on this scroll being broken open by Jesus. And then he breaks, as we read in verse 1, the 7th seal. And this leads us to our first bit of notes tonight. It says, when he opened the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. And so those first 5 seals reveal the activities of mankind bringing about great misery on the earth. And so Stacy, if you will, go ahead and throw up those the notes for us. Those first 5 seals that Jesus breaks open, they show what mankind has been up to, basically. And then the 6th seal, when Jesus breaks it is basically God's reaction to people for their persecution of the saints, for their persecution of the Christian church. And so those that are becoming Christians during the tribulation, they're being persecuted at a very significant rate. And there's millions of them being martyred for their faith. And so this 6th seal is basically God's judgment against those that are doing the persecuting. And so that gets us up to basically where we're at tonight. Those are the first 6 seals that have been broken on that scroll by Jesus. But the 7th seal introduces the 7 trumpet judgments. So basically when Jesus breaks open the 7th seal, what that does is that rolls over into the start of the trumpet judgments. And these are judgments that God sent on the earth. And these are so terrible, as it says, that the angels were silent for a half hour in heaven. Now think about that. We've already read about how there are 4 creatures that are before the Lord constantly. Cherubim, seraphim, angels, the saints, the 24 elders. All of these beings in heaven are constantly in worship of God. Constantly crying out, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. And many other things. That they are in constant worship of God. And so there is always noise going on. It's like being in a house with kids. There's always noise somewhere, somehow. There's always noise going on. And so there's always worship going on of God. And then here, Jesus cracks the 7th seal open, and the angels are probably slack-jawed and just struck with awe because they know what's coming. And so there is absolute silence. I'm not going to stand here for 30 minutes, but for 30 minutes you could hear a pin drop, so to speak, in heaven. That ought to concern us about how bad the trumpet judgments are going to be. And remember, this is the middle level of the judgments. There's still the bowl judgments to come later on. And so these things are going to get really bad really quick. And the angels know that. And so that's what we see here in verse 1. But then we go on to verse 2 where we see these 7 angels that John sees. He says, and I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and to them were given 7 trumpets. And so what we know is from other parts of the biblical text, we know that one of the angels who always stands before God is the angel Gabriel. And so we know from the Christmas story and other things where we read about the angel Gabriel, we know that he is one of the ones that stands before God always. So he is we just sort of logically deduce that he is one of the 7 angels that is given a trumpet to blast for these trumpet judgments. And so they're introducing these judgments that will sequentially happen, but they will also increase in devastation on the earth. And so in verses 3 through 5, though, we see a little bit more about the worship in heaven, because what we see here is that there's talk about the prayers of God's saints that are continually going up to Him in heaven. And so look at verses 3 through 5 with me again as we look at worship in heaven. It says, another angel who had a golden censer, which is basically like a, I don't know the best way to put it. It's sort of like a king's staff. He would have this golden censer, or this golden rod in his hand that he would use to show his royalty, his position of authority. We could see a king having this. Well, this particular angel is given one, or has one, and uses it. It says that he came and stood at the altar. Now, this altar in heaven is the same shape and structure, so to speak, as the temple that was, or the altar that was in the temple of Solomon. Basically, Solomon's temple was to be a duplication of what heaven looked like to some degree, some of the objects of worship and things like that. And so the altar was to be one of those things. And so there is this altar in heaven, and so he was given incense to offer with the prayers of all the saints, it says, on the golden altar before the throne. And so you have the throne of God, and then there is this big altar in front of him. And so it says, the smoke of the incense together with the prayers of the saints went up before God from the angel's hand. And then it says that the angel took that censer, filled it with fire from the altar, and hurled it on the earth. And there came peals of thunder, rumblings of flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. And so what we see here is that part of it is, as it says there on the screen, that the prayers of God's saints are continually going up before Him. And so these prayers are sometimes those that are being answered. And as we'll see, there are some question about unanswered prayers as well as we go through. So the real question that follows with this is, who is the angel? Who is the angel that God has this censer and is using it in this way? Some believe that the angel described or mentioned is Jesus, because he is the only one who is a mediator between God and man. But we know that that probably isn't Jesus, because Jesus sits where? At the right hand of the Father. I see some of you going right here. Jesus sits at the right hand of the Father. And so more than likely it's not Jesus. For that reason alone, in my opinion. But what we see here, though, as it talks about in your notes, is that there may have been other angels that were responsible for the care and the administration of the prayers of the saints. Okay, and that's one of the things that and they were, if they were prayers that were not yet to be answered, they would be responsible for basically holding on to those prayers, if you want to look at it from this regard, until it was time for their answer. Now, what we see here is that these prayers are continually going up before God, that they're continually being shared to God, and He's receiving prayers all the time, as we see here during the tribulation. But as it says there in verse 5, we see that there is thunder, lightning, and an earthquake as a result of what happens in heaven. Those things happen on earth as a result of the fire from the altar that occurs. Again, what happens in heaven has a corresponding result on earth. And so what happens is this angel takes that censer and casts the fire from the altar, and basically what we see is that there is thunder, lightning, and an earthquake on earth. So we see that this is the beginning of the trumpet judgments. The interesting thing is, if you remember the idea of thunder in the book of Revelation, as we've talked, thunder and lightning, those sort of things are a precursor to judgment, or a sign of God's judgment. And so this is just a reminder that this is God bringing judgment and nobody else. That God is bringing judgment on mankind at this time. And so as we begin to look in verse 6, we're going to start looking at some of these judgments. And one of the questions that is sometimes asked when we study the book of Revelation is that a sign, or is that something that's literal? Those are things that you will look at. There will be some things in future chapters that are signs. They're obviously signs, because it makes no sense that John would see this in regards to the end times unless it was a sign. But when it tells you specifically that this is something that's happening on earth, we ought to assume literally that this is something happening on the earth. And so the question that comes about with these trumpet judgments is, are the trumpet judgments literal judgments? Are these things really going to be happening on the earth? And the answer to that is that, as you see there, we should understand these judgments to be just as literal as the plagues in the book of Exodus. I would ask you right now, does anybody doubt that the 10 plagues in Egypt did not literally happen? Well, if we're Bible-believing Christians, we believe that that did happen. That yes, God turned the Nile and the water to blood. He sent the infestations of frogs and all the different things that we read about. The hailstones falling from the sky, the death of the firstborn, the darkness throughout the whole land except for the land where the Israelites were. All of these different plagues. Yeah, if we believe that those are literal plagues, then we ought to understand that they are as literal from the book of Exodus as they are in the book of Revelation. These judgments and these that we see coming about. But verse 6 says, then the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets prepared to sound them. And so what we see in the next set of verses are the first 4 trumpets being blown. And as these trumpets are blown, things happen on the earth that honestly ought to scare us to death. And ought to scare us to death from the standpoint that we're not going to be here, so it's not going to affect us in that regard, but it will affect those that we know that are not Christians yet when the rapture happens, or doesn't become a Christian after the rapture. Those family members, those co-workers, those loved ones, those friends, neighbors, whoever, if they're not Christians, they're going to be enduring this. After they've already endured the war and the pestilence and the famine and the inflation and all the stuff that we talked about in chapter 5. All of those things they've already endured. And if they didn't die because of the disease and the war and all that sort of stuff, and they're still alive, imagine what they're going to be going through in these cases. So let's look at the verse 7 and look at the first trumpet that talks about hail, fire, and blood. Verse 7 says this, when the first angel sounded his trumpet, and there came hail and fire mixed with blood, and it was hurled down upon the earth. 1/3 of the earth was burned up, 1/3 of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. And so when this first angel blows the trumpet and brings about this judgment, hail and fire mixed with blood fell on 1/3 of the earth. And we see what damage is done. Because the damage done to the earth is that 1/3 of the earth, 1/3 of the trees, and all of the green grass were burned up. And now think about that. That is a lot of real estate that is burned up because of this judgment. And when I say real estate, I just mean land in general. In your notes, this isn't in your book. I actually had to go figure this out and do some research at one time to find out how much of the earth 1/3 of the earth is. And in your notes, it should tell you that this would affect about 19 million square miles on Earth. And that's equal to North America, South America, Australia, and all the South Pacific Islands being completely burned up. I mean, think about that. We're not talking about just a little bit here and there. We're talking about 1/3 of the earth. All of North America, from Canada to the tip of Mexico, and everything in between. Everything to the bottom of South America, Australia, and every bit of those South Pacific Islands. That's the equivalent of the amount of land mass that will be burned up as a result of this first trumpet. And remember, there's going to be folks on earth during this time that heard about Jesus but never made a decision for him before the rapture. And they're going to be enduring this. Because remember, when we looked at the timeline, this is only less than 3.5 years after the rapture. So this is just a matter of years after you and I are raptured out of the earth. This isn't like decades later. This is just a matter of a couple of months in some regards. Not long after that. But then we see in verses 8 and 9, we see the second trumpet and what happens there about a mountain being thrown into the sea. Look at verses 8 and 9. It says, the second angel sounded his trumpet, and something like a huge mountain, all ablaze, was thrown into the sea. 1/3 of the sea turned into blood, 1/3 of the living creatures in the sea died, and 1/3 of the ships were destroyed. And so there is this huge mountain that falls into the sea, and as best we know, this would be something like a huge meteorite, a huge asteroid, whatever you want to call it. And the damage that is done because of this one is that a third of the sea turned to blood, a third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed by a giant burning meteorite, basically. I mean, that's very powerful. When you think about a third of the sea being turned to blood, sounds a lot like the plagues of Exodus. And not only that, a third of all the living creatures in the sea, a third of the whales, a third of the sharks, a third of the fish, a third of all of those animals that we enjoy catching down there at Caswell off of the pier, a third of them are gone. All of those creatures, a third of them are just wiped out. And a third of the ships. Now, if you remember from reading in the book, if you have the book and you've been keeping up with that, we know that in the end times, Babylon, as John talks about later, Babylon it will be founded again or rediscovered, or however you want to. It's going to come back around, basically. They're going to rebuild, that's the word I was looking for, rebuild Babylon. And it will be a commercial center. We're going to read about that in future chapters. But when we do, what we'll understand is that it will be a huge commercial center for the world. And in the course of that, there's going to still be commerce and things like that. And these ships will be ones that will be carrying things on the ocean. Now, and a third of those will be destroyed because of this second trumpet. Now, here is the thing. When you read in the scriptures in the Bible, and it talks about a sea, generally what they're talking about is the Mediterranean Sea. Okay? And I mean, this is a large body of water. But when you read in the commentary, Dr. LaHaye, he talks about how he believes that that's most likely what they're talking about is the Mediterranean Sea. I differ. I just differ in my view of it. Yes, it very well could be the Mediterranean Sea, but I feel like because the tribulation affects worldwide, the entire world, that when it says the sea, it means a third of the body of water on the earth. And the reason I say that is because there's no stipulations as to a third of the ground being burned up. So why would there be stipulations on the water that is turned to blood? It's one of those things. It really isn't going to matter because a third of either one's going to be really bad. But I feel like it's more than likely a third of the water of the oceans and things like that. If that is the case, though, that would mean that 49 million square miles of ocean would be ruined by this. That's the equivalent. It would be equivalent to the Atlantic and Arctic oceans being completely turned to blood. I mean, that's powerful. I mean, that is huge when we really think about how much would be destroyed during these judgments. And remember, these are they're compounding on each other. They're going one after the other. And so all of this fire breaks out, and all this ground is burned up. And so you imagine the smoke and the smog and the haze in the air, and then the water is ruined. And so you see how God is using this to shake humanity to its core to understand their need for salvation. And so after this, we see that there is the third judgment. And that is that a great star crashes to earth. Look at verses 10 and 11. It says, "The third angel sounded his trumpet, and a great star blazing like a torch fell from the sky on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters turned bitter, and many people died from the waters that had become bitter." And so right here we see that there is something like a star, as it's called, falls out of the sky, and as it says, it's a great star blazing like a torch. It sounds almost like a comet. Don't know exactly, again, we don't know exactly what it is, but it sounds like something like that. When it hits the ground or hits the world, basically in some way it pollutes a third of the world's water supply. And turns it bitter. People die from it. So it's obviously some sort of poisonous bitterness that comes along with it. What wormwood is, we don't know. It's just it's wormwood, or the word that is used for that. It basically means bitterness. And so we don't know what it is or why it's called that, other than the fact it makes the water bitter. But it hits in some way or in some place that it actually has the ability to poison a third of the water. Now, does that mean that it's going to land in a place that let's say strategically somewhere around around Turkey, that would pollute waters like the Nile and the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers, things like that. Yeah, it very well could be. We don't know. But what we do know is that there will be a third of the water supply will be polluted by this. And so what this does is so we've got all this fire and smoke and smog going along with that. A third of the oceans, which is undrinkable to us anyway, but it does carry a lot of the seafood that we eat. A third of the ocean is destroyed. And now the water that we can actually drink, a third of that has been destroyed. It's become poisonous and bitter and unable to be drank by us. Well, then comes the fourth trumpet. So things are progressively getting worse. And let's see what happens in verse 12 here. It says, the fourth angel sounded his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of them turned dark. A third of the day was without light, and also a third of the night. And so when this fourth angel blows this fourth trumpet, what we see is that the sun, the moon, and the stars lose a third of their light. So that's the damage that's done by this particular trumpet, is that a third of the sun, a third of the moon, and a third of the stars go dark. And that's hard for us to understand, maybe not so much since we had an eclipse last year. But for us to understand, let me put it to you this way. I don't understand how a third of the sun can go dark. I don't understand how I understand that a third of the moon would go dark if a third of the sun goes dark, because the moon just reflects the light of the sun. So that sort of makes sense. But how the sun loses a third of its light, I don't understand. I don't know. And I've not read anything that describes what could possibly cause that. Because it's not like you're looking at this big ball in the sky and then just a third of it is black. Does it mean that the sun diminishes by its light by a third? It's a third less powerful? I just don't know. I don't know. I don't have an answer for you on that. But what we see is that this is going to make it seem as if the night and day are sort of reversed. Right now most of the time we have somewhere around 10 to 12 hours of daylight either way, and 10 to 12 hours of night depending on the season and stuff that's going on. A lot of times you have somewhere around in there, but what's going to happen is we're going to have 8-hour days and 16-hour nights. It's going to be like we live in Alaska all the time, if you were alive during the tribulation. There's going to be, a third of the night is going to lose its light because of the moon losing a third of its light. But the day is going to be shortened by a third as well, because the day is no longer going to have that third of light because of the sun. And so you're talking about 16-hour nights and 8-hour days, which, we think, well, that ain't all that bad, but it's a big difference when you think about the ecological differences that it's going to have for the environment, what it's going to do for livestock and animals and fish and birds and all of that. So it's going to be chaos for sure. But then what we see is that verse 13 wraps up the end of these first 4 trumpet judgments with a warning from an angel. Look at what it says there. It says, in verse 13, it says, as I watched, I heard an eagle that was flying in midair call out in a loud voice, woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, because of the trumpet blast about to be sounded by the other 3 angels. And so right here, this is a special angel that looks similar to an eagle, or however the case may be. But this particular angel warns about the remaining trumpet judgments of God. And what we see is that they will be worse than the others. Now think about it. We've lost a third of the earth to fire, and then you've got the resulting smoke and smog and health problems there. Then you have a third of the ocean, and a third of those creatures are lost. Then you have the third of the waters that are drinkable are no longer usable because of being poisoned. And then you lose a third of the light from the heavenly bodies. And now, here comes an angel to tell you, guess what? It's only going to get worse, folks. That's basically what he's saying. And to the point he's crying out woe, as far as, be warned. Here is what's going to happen. And this introduces what is called the 3 woes of Revelation. And basically what that is are the 5th, 6th, and 7th trumpet judgments. That's all those are. It's not that they're any different as far as the way they're presented or anything like that. But those three woes, those three terrible judgments that are about to follow are the fifth, sixth, and seventh trumpet judgments. And, things are just progressively getting worse. And remember, we're not even to the bowl judgments yet. We're not even to the final judgments against mankind and against the earth. And so it's only going to get worse from here. And what we ought to see from this is all the more reason why we ought to be evangelistic in everything that we say and do. Because there will be people, if, say, the rapture happens within the next 10 years. I'm not saying that it will. I'm just saying that if it did. Within the next 10 years, if it were to happen, then there are people that we know right now that are not saved that will go through the rapture, that will endure some of these things if they last long enough. Because there will be people that die because of war and pestilence and famine and all these other things that are happening earlier in the book of Revelation. They may not even make it to this part. That's why we need to be all the more evangelistic in everything that we say and do, inviting people to church, encouraging them to come so that they can hear the gospel and respond and not have to endure this. And so that's where we end tonight.